It is our obligation to take you...
At the dawn of the 20th century, there is no hiding from New York City's newly powerful Department of Health.
There is very little that a Board of Health cannot do in the way of interfering with personal and property rights for the protection of public health.
And with good reason. The city slums are overflowing with poor immigrants. Conditions are horrific. Infectious disease is out of control.
Children were dying of intestinal diseases, of diarrheas. Tuberculosis, whooping cough, and diphtheria were endemic.
But not here. Oyster Bay, Long Island is another world altogether. A place upper-crust New Yorkers go to escape the city. But suddenly this privileged enclave becomes vulnerable. A deadly disease, typhoid fever, strikes the household of a wealthy banker. How it got here is a mystery that confounds the experts.
I was disappointed. Try as I would, I could not find anything wrong.
Only within the last 20 years have health officials come to understand that disease is caused by invisible microbes or germs. This knowledge will lead them to an unsuspecting Irish immigrant, a servant named Mary Mallon.
They called her, I love this phrase, she is a human culture tube. You know, this pestilential entity that must be stopped.
Get out of my kitchen!
Miss Mallon, please.
Get out of my
I beseech
kitchen!
you in the
They
name
call her Typhoid Mary. Her story will make history and raise challenging questions we still face today.
Keep going!
It is the prime dilemma in public health. How do you protect the health of the masses of the people if it is jeopardized by an individual whose liberty you are thinking of taking away?
I am an innocent human being. The contention that I am a perpetual menace in the spread of typhoid germs is not true.
An innocent victim or a murderous villain? The tragic story of the most dangerous woman in America, right now on Nova.
Corporate funding for Nova is provided by Sprint and Microsoft. Additional funding is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
This program has been made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be.
And by the National Library of Medicine. Major funding for Nova is also provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by PBS viewers like you. Thank you.
August 1906. In this luxurious vacation home in Oyster Bay, Long Island, a young girl, Margaret Warren, is gravely ill with typhoid fever. She has the best care, but without a cure. All anyone can do is try to bring down her fever. This is the last thing Charles Warren, banker to the Vanderbilts, expected when he rented a house for his family in this exclusive seaside resort.
This was a family that brought servants with them and came to summer out on the island. And this individual family, no one else in Oyster Bay, but this individual family was struck by typhoid fever, and 6 members of the household came down with the disease.
Typhoid fever is extremely contagious. First, the youngest daughter became ill, then 2 maids, the mother, another daughter, and finally the gardener. How could a disease of the slums strike this wealthy community?
It wasn't the sort of area that one would expect to see typhoid, which is often associated with crowded, poor neighborhoods.
At the turn of the 20th century, the most crowded neighborhood in the world is New York City's Lower East Side. It's even more crowded than Calcutta. With few connections to city water or sewer, the tenements lack even basic sanitation. Infectious diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever kill thousands each year.
Typhoid fever was a fairly common visitor in New York City and in other urban areas, especially in the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century. In New York City alone, there were about 4,000 new cases of typhoid fever every year.
The symptoms of typhoid can be severe. Weeks of fever, headache, diarrhea, and delirium. 1 out of 10 dies of the disease.
When people had typhoid fever in the early 20th century and there were no antibiotics, doctors had to just treat the symptoms.
But the cause of the disease is no longer a mystery. 30 years earlier, scientist Louis Pasteur electrified the world by proving that bacteria, microbes invisible to the naked eye, cause disease. Typhoid fever comes from Salmonella typhi, bacteria that grow in the intestinal tract and are shed in the feces. In 1892, New York City set up the country's first bacteriology laboratory devoted to public health.
The new science, the new bacteriology, was tremendously exciting. This focused on what can we see under the microscope, what can we do once we diagnose people with specific diseases, what can we do to prevent this from being spread to other people?
In Oyster Bay, where even President Teddy Roosevelt summers, the threat of a typhoid epidemic is terrifying.
Everybody started looking around for an explanation. They started looking for the usual suspects. Let's find the dirty, the poor, maybe some bad dairy, the lady on the beach who sells shellfish. It's got to be one of them.
Experts are called in to investigate. They know typhoid fever is caused by contaminated food or drink. They suspect the plumbing in the house and put dye in the toilet to see if it contaminates the drinking water. It doesn't. They check the local shellfish to see if the bay is polluted with sewage. It isn't. They examine the milk supply in case it is contaminated. It, too, is free of bacteria. The source of the outbreak remains a mystery. Though the Oyster Bay victims recover, a cloud of disease hangs over the house.
The family who owned the house, the Thompsons, were afraid if they didn't get to the bottom of this, they would never be able to rent their house again.
That winter, the Thompsons learn about a freelance civil engineer known for his ability to track down the source of disease. 37-year-old George Soper is confident and ambitious.
By 1907, I had a great deal of experience with typhoid fever. As an undergraduate, I had the temerity to move typhoid patients and their families out of a house that had a long history of communicable diseases and, with the consent of the owner, burn it to the ground.
George Soper was somebody who got his teeth into a problem and would not let go. He wanted to find the cause. He was not going to give up until he did, and so he was obsessed.
Soper begins by reviewing the results of the earlier investigation.
It's detective work. And Soper was excited about the ability now to trace diseases, to trace the disease outbreaks, and to really understand how diseases like typhoid were being spread.
The first investigators had done their work thoroughly. Try as I would, I could not find anything wrong. So I turned my attention to the people in the house. This gave the key to the situation.
Finally, he asked the question of one of the members of the household, who else was in this house that I didn't yet talk to? And one of them remembered that they'd had a cook that summer that was no longer with the family.
Knowing it takes up to 3 weeks after exposure to become sick with the disease, Soper uncovers his first clue.
I found that the family had changed cooks on August 4th, about 3 weeks before the epidemic broke out. All the patients were infected after the new cook's arrival.
The way that a cook who was infected with the typhoid bacillus would transmit the disease is that there would probably be some typhoid bacillus that they got onto their hands while they were in the bathroom.
To prevent the transmission of typhoid, a lot of brushing and scrubbing was involved, meaning under the nails, no jewelry. I mean, we're talking a vigorous and abrasive scrubbing.
Soper also knows the bacteria can survive on uncooked food only.
On a certain Sunday, there was a dessert which she prepared, and of which everybody present was extremely fond. This was ice cream with fresh peaches cut up in it. I suppose no better way could be found for a cook to clean her hands of microbes and infect a family.
The cook is a 37-year-old Irish immigrant who works for wealthy families in New York.
Before God and in the eyes of decent men, my name is Mary Mallon, and I have lived a decent and upright life.
Soper sets out to find the cook. The employment agency that placed her with the Warrens does not know where she is, but directs him to some of her previous employers. What he discovers astounds him.
In 10 years, she is known to have worked for 8 families, and in 6 of these, typhoid had occurred.
How is this possible? Has Mary been spreading typhoid bacteria for years without ever appearing to be sick? Soper remembers reading a paper written 4 years earlier by German scientist Robert Koch. Koch had found a baker who was not ill, but who spread typhoid germs, a so-called healthy carrier of disease. Could this be the case with Mary Mallon?
Soper had read that literature and thought he was on the cutting edge of, medical science and history.
If Soper is right, the cook would be the first American identified as a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. It would be a major discovery and make his career.
I think Soper is very excited by this possibility. He sees it as a scientific puzzle that he is the detective for, and he's going to sleuth out and win the prize.
To prove his case, Soper needs specimens from the cook. In March 1907, he learns Mary is working for a family on Park Avenue. Typhoid, too, is already in residence. A chambermaid has just been taken to the hospital, and the family's only child is in critical condition. Mary helps nurse the girl.
Here you go, my darling. Oh, I know. Just hold on in there. Just hold on.
It was at this house that I had my first interview with Mary. I supposed she would be glad to know the truth. I thought I could count on her cooperation.
Soper's account of their meeting is almost theatrical.
Miss Mary Mallon?
I'm Mary Mallon.
Miss Mallon, my name is Dr. George Soper. I have been looking for you for quite a while. I was hired to track you down.
To track me down?
Yes, Miss Mallon. It appears that you are the unwitting cause of the typhoid fever outbreak at Oyster Bay last summer.
Are you mad?
It is imperative that I get specimens from you of urine, feces, and blood to confirm my suspicion.
I've never been sick a day in my life. I've never had typhoid.
Miss Mallon, you contain within your body typhoid fever germs. When you visit the toilet, these germs get on your fingers. You then transmit these germs to the food.
Are you suggesting that I don't wash my hands?
No, Miss Mallory.
Soper claims that the meeting ended badly when Mary reached down, picked up a meat fork, and threatened to, stab him with it.
Get out of my kitchen!
Miss Mellon, please.
Get out of my
Miss
kitchen
Mellon,
and
please,
don't come
try-
back
try to
again!
be reasonable.
Keep going! I don't want to see you back here again! Keep going!
I think that he makes her sound a lot more fearsome than she was, simply to explain the fact that, she scared the hell out of him.
He unleashed a violent temper in her by what he thought was a mild request, reasonable request, a scientific request. And she sees it as the exact opposite of that.
Soper did not mention the families where I have worked where there was no typhoid. He did not see fit to mention the family I always lived with in the Bronx when I was out of work, and where I shared a room with the children without giving them typhoid.
Mary Mallon had no reason to think that she could have communicated typhoid fever to anybody. The concept that if you are sick with a particular disease, you can give it to somebody else is fairly new.
Why would you believe all of a sudden a group of scientists telling you that invisible germs that you can't even see, that you've never heard of before, are causing all these diseases that you've seen for decades and decades?
Like most people of her time, Mary Mallon does not understand the cause of disease.
In the 19th century, you had this idea about disease that somehow it came from filth. And filth was somehow a moral statement about your community. So the filthier your community, the more subject you were to having what were called miasmas arise.
People thought that illness came from mysterious sewer gases, miasmas. We're not far away from evil spirits.
Miasmas, and the filth that caused them, were thought to be concentrated in the tenements overflowing with immigrants. With the population doubling every decade, city services were unable to cope.
It's a city that's being traversed by 150 to 200,000 horses. And of course, basic public health fact number one is that each horse gives off about 25 pounds of manure a day. Times 200,000 horses, times 365 days in which the manure may or may not be picked up. So the city was really filthy.
Uncollected garbage, animal carcasses, back alley privies, clogged sewers, and household waste made conditions unbearable. Cleaning up the city became a moral crusade. In 1895, a Department of Sanitation was created, proclaiming, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." It recruited an army of street cleaners, the White Wings.
There were parades of these guys. These guys would march down Fifth Avenue. It's almost like a military exercise.
At the same time, public health is shifting its focus from brooms to bacteriology. George Soper is part of that change.
George Soper was on the cutting edge of the new science, but he's coming from an older field of sanitation that he is in some sense trying to leave behind. Having Mary Mallon deemed a typhoid carrier would lead to a new kind of respect, a new credibility in the science of bacteriology.
I discovered that Mary was spending the evenings at a rooming house on 3rd Avenue below 33rd Street with a disreputable-looking man named Bryhoff, who had a room on the top floor and to whom she was taking food. He kept his headquarters during the day in a saloon on the corner. I got to be well acquainted with him. He took me to see the room. I should not care to see another like it.
Soper describes it as a horrifyingly squalid, fetid, evil apartment with a, menacing, mangy-looking, probably dangerous dog. Bryhoff is this degenerate, alcoholic. This is class war with all its prejudices at its purest.
And the new generation of public health people had a kind of condescension to the poor. You have this kind of mix of belief in bacteriology, a belief that there are germs there, and embedded in that is a belief that the immigrant is kind of a source of real infection and danger.
Soper made some arrangement with Bryhoff, the boyfriend. He somehow turned Bryhoff. He got Bryhoff to tell him when Mary was going to be visiting the apartment next.
Good evening, Miss Mallon.
What are you doing here?
Miss Mallon, this is my assistant, Dr. Hubler. We've come with the hope that you will cooperate and come with us.
I've already told you. I'm doing nothing for you.
Miss Mallon, I believe that you are making people sick. I believe that you are the cause of the typhoid outbreaks in several of the families you've worked for. Now, nobody is claiming that you have done this intentionally, but we need to have these specimens so that we can understand this illness and help you.
I've nursed those people that were sick in those households, and I've never had typhoid, so how could I give it to them?
Miss Mallon, please, come with us and we can be certain.
I can't believe that you followed me. You followed me in the street. You've come to my place of work, and now you've come to my home. How did you find...
His interpersonal skills were not as good as his epidemiological skills. He tracked her down. Maybe he should have left the interview portion of the case to someone else.
Go! Both of you! Get out of here now! Go! Get out!
She threw him out again, swearing apparently the whole way, and also protesting her innocence.
Get out!
Still thinking, why is this man harassing me?
I have never had typhoid fever in my life and have always been healthy. The contention that I am a perpetual menace in the spread of typhoid germs is not true.
These Irish immigrant women were tough. I mean, they had lived a life of such deprivation in Ireland. They came into a society that vilified them, that associated them with every negative stereotype. Stupid, drunken, dirty, that they were unfit for participation in the American sort of mainstream. They had to be tough.
Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in County Tyrone, one of the poorest regions of Ireland.
Life in County Tyrone in the years Mary was growing up was really harsh. Every year there would have been times of famine. She would have grown up eating primarily potatoes. There were no plates, no forks. It was a very grim existence.
She came to this country in 1883, alone as a teenager. She moved in with her aunt and uncle in New York City. Her aunt and uncle then died, and she always described herself later as alone in America.
She probably put in her time on a laundry, seamstress work, cleaning, hauling coal, all the usual lower echelon tasks. So it was quite a climb. She at some point had to learn how to cook well, how to run a kitchen well, and apparently was good at what she did. She was hired again and again by very good families.
Cook was the highest rung of the pecking order among servants. And she was often not just cook, but she was really the kind of manager of the entire enterprise and would have been the most trusted member of the staff.
Mary's employers are unaware that their cook may have brought typhoid fever into their home.
I felt a good deal of responsibility for the case. Under suitable conditions, Mary might start a great epidemic.
But Soper alone does not have the authority to force Mary to cooperate. Typhoid fever, smallpox, influenza, diphtheria, tuberculosis. The man leading the charge against these scourges is Herman Biggs, New York City's health commissioner. Biggs is committed to wiping out disease using science and the tools of public health. In this crusade, workers have the right to march into tenements to vaccinate people, confine the infected to their houses, and use force to quarantine those who will not comply on islands in New York Harbor. This is the power needed to confront Mary Mallon.
I laid the facts concerning Mary's history before Dr. Herman Biggs, with a suggestion that the woman be taken into custody and her specimens examined.
Dr. Soper asked to have an inspector sent to get specimens from Mary. I was the inspector assigned this seemingly simple task.
Trained as a physician, Dr. S. Josephine Baker is one of the Department of Health's roving inspectors.
You know, all the things that people did in the story of Mary Mallon, picking the woman seemed like a really smart, sensible, human move.
Baker came from a fairly well-off family. She was very committed to the poor and to improving the health of the poor. However, she had nothing kind to say about the people that she worked among, and yet there she was committing her life to them.
The heat, the smells, the squalor made Hell's Kitchen something not to be believed. Its residents were largely Irish, incredibly shiftless, wholly lacking in any ambition, and dirty to an unbelievable degree. I climbed stair after stair, knocked on door after door, met drunk after drunk, filthy mother after filthy mother, and dying baby after dying baby.
In the home where Mary Mallon works, the daughter dies of typhoid fever. Mary must be taken in for testing.
I stationed one policeman in the front of the house, another on the nearest side street, had an ambulance waiting around the corner, and with a third policeman at my elbow, I knocked at the servants' entrance.
Miss Mallon, the health department has sent me to take you with us.
I'm going nowhere!
Gee, officer!
Mary sees her, brandishes a fork again, supposedly. Mary goes on a lam, tries to get away, with police searching everywhere.
Has Mary Mallon come through here?
The rest of the servants denied knowing anything about her or where she was. Even in my distress, I liked that loyalty. We went through every nook and cranny. It was utter defeat. Then one of the policemen with me caught sight of a tiny scrap of blue calico caught in a door in a back hallway. Several ash cans were heaped up in front of it.
Mary, I am under instructions to bring you in to take samples from you.
Nowhere.
Now, Mary, you have typhoid germs in your body. We will not hurt you.
They pull Mary Mallon out, scratching and screaming and yelling.
No! Let me go! I'm not...
It takes the 5 police officers to get her into the ambulance. And Josephine Baker sits on her in the ambulance the whole way to Willard Parker Hospital, where they're going to take her.
It was like being in a cage with an angry lion.
Mary is taken to Willard Parker Hospital, an infectious disease facility for the poor.
There's a photograph of Mary Mallon in bed at Willard Parker Hospital. And she is in a room with a lot of other people. Who knows if they have typhoid fever or something else, or why she's in bed since she's not sick.
Being brought to Willard Parker was, in some sense, a statement about Mary's worth that she would have understood very clearly. She would have said, oh my God, you know, how dare they? I mean, this was a real kind of insult to her.
I have committed no crime, and I am treated like an outcast, a criminal. It is unjust, outrageous, uncivilized. And it is incredible that in a Christian community, a defenseless woman can be treated in this manner.
At New York City's pioneering bacteriology laboratory, scientists test Mary's specimens using the most advanced tools and techniques. Samples are placed in an incubator to see if bacteria grow. The results are unambiguous.
The hospital's laboratories speedily proved that Mary was as dangerous as Dr. Soper had suspected. Her stools were a living culture of typhoid bacilli.
George Soper knew all along from his work that she could carry typhoid fever. This was proof that she did carry typhoid fever.
Soper has made a major breakthrough in the battle against disease, proving that Mary harbors the bacteria, even though she insists she has never had typhoid fever.
Mary Mallon did have typhoid fever, but she had a very, very mild case of the disease. And she never knew she had typhoid fever or was that sick at all. In fact, she probably just thought she had a cold or the flu.
In most cases of typhoid fever, the body is host to a microbial battle where there is a clear winner. If the bacteria win, the patient dies. If the immune system wins, the typhoid bacteria die. But in the case of a healthy carrier, there is no clear winner. The immune system protects the body from infection, but the bacteria continue to live. Mary, with no symptoms at all, is as contagious as someone sick with the disease.
The press gets a hold of the story immediately in 1907, but they don't get very much of it. The health department is clearly trying to keep a lid on the fact that they are holding, against her will, a healthy 37-year-old woman.
Still, the story makes front-page news. To protect Mary's identity, the Department of Health gives the newspaper a false name. But Mary cannot escape a visit from George Soper. He is anxious to learn when she was exposed to typhoid and how often she has passed it on.
She, of course, immediately sees him as he's red. She doesn't want him there, and she's not talking to him. But he's talking to her, and he has learned a little bit, presumably from their first encounters, and he's trying to be reasonable.
Mary, I said, I've come to talk with you and see if between us we cannot get you out of here. You would not be where you are now if you had not been so obstinate. So throw off your wrong-headed idea and be reasonable. Answer my questions and I will do everything I can to get you out. I will write a book about your case. I will guarantee that you get all the profits.
This is fairly forward thinking. I mean, these days, you walk out of a burning building and there's somebody offering you a book deal right away, and a film deal. Maybe he was ahead of his time here, and he even offered her 100%, which is quite reasonable. On the other hand, I can certainly understand why she turned down the deal.
She gets up, marches into the toilet, slams the door, and doesn't come out until he's gone.
The door slammed. There was no need of my waiting.
What should health officials do? They can't let Mary return to cooking, but how can they stop her? Typically, poor people with infectious diseases are sent to a quarantine island. And that's what they do with Mary.
Without trial, without representation, without any kind of due process, the law allowed you to be plucked off the street and deposited on a plague island for as long as they felt like keeping you there.
Civil liberties have to sometimes be bent for the public good. And I think that, while it may be perceived as a conflict, most serious people in public health, and I think in the country, would understand that depriving an individual of her freedom for hopefully a brief period of time, that's a legitimate step to take.
North Brother Island sits in the East River, a few hundred yards offshore from the South Bronx. This is the site of the city's largest quarantine facility, Riverside Hospital. Most of the patients are sick with tuberculosis. They must stay here until they recover or die.
North Brother Island was a scary place to go to. Here are hundreds of patients very sick with infectious diseases. And then Mary Mallon, who everybody admits is perfectly healthy, is sent out there.
Mary is confined to a small cottage on the island.
She was being cut off from everyone and everything she was familiar with. So it was really imprisonment. I don't think she would have seen it as anything other than a form of imprisonment.
When I came here, I was so nervous. I was almost prostrated with grief and trouble. My eyes began to twitch. My left eye became paralyzed, would not move. It remained in this condition for 6 months.
Not everyone in public health believes Mary's quarantine is justified. Dr. Milton Rossenow, director of the National Hygienic Laboratory in Washington, and other prominent scientists object to her incarceration.
They understood her dangers. They accepted that she was a healthy carrier. And yet they said, all you have to do is retrain her for another job where she's not cooking. And then she won't be a danger to anybody.
But the Department of Health is determined not to let Mary go. Instead, doctors try to cure her with experimental drugs and procedures.
I took Eurotropin for about 3 months all told. If I should have continued it, it would have killed me, for it was very severe. At first, I would not take it, for I am a little afraid of these people, and I have good right.
She never listened to reason. When they suggested removing her gallbladder, the probable focus of infection, she was convinced afresh that this was a pretext for killing her.
Mary's doctors have a hunch, incorrect as it turns out, that removing the gallbladder will cure her.
They said they'd have the best surgeon in town to do the cutting, but I said no. No knife will be put on me. I've nothing the matter with my gallbladder.
I think Mary Mallon may have made a very good choice there. If she'd had surgery, she probably would have survived, but the rates of infection and other problems were higher, and there is a chance she might have died from routine gallbladder surgery.
Mary is kept on North Brother Island, but wages a steady battle. She writes letter after letter to Biggs, Soper, and Baker, pleading for her freedom.
Why should I be banished like a leper and compelled to live in solitary confinement? A few years of this life and I will be insane.
Two years go by. Mary is even more desperate to regain her freedom.
Will I submit quietly to staying here a prisoner all my life? No. As there is a God in heaven, I will get justice somehow, sometime.
In June 1909, Mary and a young Irish lawyer, George O'Neill, file suit in the New York Supreme Court, demanding her release.
Her argument was very simple. I've never been sick, therefore I can't transmit sickness to anybody else. And I've never gotten my day in court. There has been no due process.
A few days later, publisher William Randolph Hearst tells Mary's story in his New York American. He may even be financing her legal case to sell newspapers. This time, her identity is revealed, but Typhoid Mary is the name that sticks. The story includes an article by William Park, head of the city's bacteriological lab. He writes that new screening procedures have uncovered at least 50 healthy carriers of typhoid fever. Only Mary is in quarantine.
The health department knows, and the reason they haven't isolated the other 49 is because walking around the city streets, mingling with people in New York, was not at all dangerous. Mary Mallon only transmitted typhoid fever when she cooked for people.
July 1909. Mary Mallon leaves North Brother Island for the first time in 2 years to plead her case before the New York Supreme Court. The Department of Health defends its position.
The health department argued very strongly that there was proof in the laboratory that she was a carrier and therefore dangerous to the public health, a menace to the public health. And they argued that point.
Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
It would come without warning. It would jump from house to house. It could come into a house and make one person sick, 2 people sick, but not make the other people sick. It attacked the rich, it attacked the poor, it attacked the clean, it attacked the dirty.
For 2 centuries, it terrorized the nation, bankrupted cities, took tens of thousands of lives. It was called the Visitor, the Invader.
Yellow fever was horrible. The patient is spraying black vomit across the room. They're in agony. They're screaming. It happened so fast. It killed so quickly.
The only thing that comes close to the fear that yellow fever engendered back in the 19th century is a biological attack, where an unknown agent moves around the community in some way that's sort of random. It makes no sense.
Unraveling the mystery of yellow fever would take a leap of logic by an obscure scientist. The conversion of a skeptical army doctor. And a young surgeon's ultimate sacrifice. In the summer of 1693, Admiral Joseph Wheeler's fleet arrived in Boston from the West Indies with a cargo of rum and sugar. Within weeks, men and women scattered across the city began to show symptoms of a strange illness. Jaundice, high fever, black vomit. Yellow fever had come to America. For the next 200 years, the disease would strike city after city with frightening regularity and no apparent cause.
There are some severe epidemics that take place. Late 1700s, Philadelphia loses 10% of its population. As we move into the 1800s, the disease moves south, away from the northeastern seaboard to the southern states. There are some devastating epidemics that strike along the Gulf Coast, especially in New Orleans.
Hot and humid, bustling with trade from the Caribbean, where the fever was present year-round, New Orleans was especially vulnerable to yellow fever. Summer epidemics would claim hundreds, even thousands of lives.
There was no way to protect yourself from it. Even though they knew that it would come in the summer, sometimes it didn't come. There were some summers where there was very little yellow fever. And then another summer it would come and it would be a scourge of biblical proportions.
On July 24, 1878, the New Orleans Picayune confirmed 14 cases and 7 deaths in the crowded tenements of the First District. Soon, cases of yellow fever were reported in the better sections of town. Panic gripped the city.
There was no way to predict who was going to be next or how it was going to spread. The way it moved through a community, from house to house, skipping houses, skipping neighborhoods, coming back and getting neighborhoods later on, attacking rich and poor in some way that makes no sense. It's sort of random. The way it attacked and what it did to its victims just horrified people.
People develop a headache, they develop fever, they develop back pain, they hurt all over and ache all over. And these symptoms usually last for about 48 to 72 hours. And it's just like having the flu. And then the virus attacks the liver. And when the liver is destroyed, proteins, which are very necessary for proper blood coagulation, are also destroyed.
You would bleed from your eyes, from your nose, from your mouth. One of the worst aspects of the disease in its final stages was that you're bleeding internally into your stomach, and then that blood is digested and you end up vomiting it out, and it's sort of like wet coffee grounds. It's not a quiet death. You are struggling, you're frantic. Doctors would have to strap their patients down while they watched them die.
New Orleans physicians struggled to treat and understand an illness that seemed to defy all explanation. They prescribed bloodlettings, carbolic acid, massive doses of quinine. To ward off the illness, citizens covered themselves in mustard plaster, shut windows to keep the fever out. Burned tar in the belief that the smoke would disturb the miasma, the noxious emissions that for centuries had been thought to carry disease. The city became a smoke-filled hell, pierced by the anguished sounds of the dying and the acrid smell of putrefying blood. Those who could fled in the tens of thousands.
People are running in fear. Those who remain are struggling to survive. There may be no food coming in. There is no goods going out. All commerce grinds to a halt.
With everything shut up and closed, New Orleans quickly became a ghost town. The whole fabric of life is disrupted in ways that other diseases didn't do.
For decades, yellow fever had been a southern scourge, its ravages confined below the Mason-Dixon line. But now, steamboats and railroads united the country, north to south, east to west. Yellowjack, as the disease was known, could travel far and travel fast.
1878 is a turning point in the history of yellow fever. People are more mobile than they were in the pre-Civil War period. Yellow fever has new opportunities for moving away from the port where it's introduced. And it does. It takes those opportunities. It rides the rails out to Mobile, up to Memphis, over to Chattanooga.
To Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois. Even into Ohio it went, aboard trains crowded with refugees heading north.
Towns where those people might go to didn't want them to come, so people burned bridges, they tore up train tracks, anything to keep the epidemic out.
Some states set up official quarantines, but in many towns, citizens took matters into their own hands.
Armed men would meet the trains and either force them to go on or turn back, and they called that shotgun quarantines. One man with a shotgun is going to keep a train either moving or at least keep people from getting off of it.
But there was no stopping Yellow Jack. The epidemic spread to 11 states and 200 communities. 120,000 people became infected. The King of Terrors continues to snatch victims with fearful rapidity, wrote a Memphis resident. One by one, those who remain in the city and are liable to the monster malady are taken down. By the time it ended with the arrival of the first frost, the great Mississippi Valley epidemic had taken 20,000 lives. Economic losses were estimated in the hundreds of millions. The city of Memphis was forced to declare bankruptcy. As news spread, the magnitude of the tragedy registered in every corner of the nation, from San Francisco to New York.
Suddenly, what had been a southern problem was now a national problem in terms of finance and in terms of just spread of disease. And the feeling is the South cannot take care of this problem themselves. Either they won't because they're stupid or they're inept or they're too poor, and the federal government really needs to step in here because now the South's problems are everybody's problems.
The federal government took decisive action. Congress established the National Board of Health with authority to intervene in a public health emergency. The board would also help southern states put in place sanitary improvements and administer a quarantine system designed to keep yellow fever from entering the United States. But neither sanitation nor quarantine would prove to be enough. What was needed were answers to some crucial questions about yellow fever and how it spread. At his laboratory in his home in Old Havana, Dr. Carlos Finlay had been studying yellow fever for quite some time. The son of a Scottish father and a French mother, Finlay had left Cuba as a young man to study in Europe, then at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He returned to Cuba in 1864, where he settled down. In 1872, he began to investigate yellow fever, a disease that year after year swept through his native country. He looked at changes in temperature, altitude, even the alkalinity of the atmosphere. Then, young Dr. Finlay made a scientific breakthrough.
He had read that some diseases could be spread through an intermediate host. There's a particular disease of wheat that has to first incubate in another plant before it can be spread. So he deduced that what was necessary to spread it was an agent that would take it from the sick person to a healthy person.
In 1879, an American scientist handed Finlay his next clue: microscopic slides of tissue from yellow fever victims.
And he left Finley with some photographs that clearly indicated to Finley that yellow fever must be spread somehow through lesions in the blood vessels, that it must be a biting insect that accesses those blood vessels. That's how he first came upon the idea that it was a mosquito.
With nearly 1,000 species of mosquitoes, Finley searched painstakingly for the one that transmitted the disease.
What he did was he figured out where that mosquito was present, and he mapped that against where cases of yellow fever occurred. And since they mapped perfectly to each other, he deduced that yellow fever was spread by this particular mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito.
It was a remarkable idea, perhaps too remarkable for its time.
In the 1880s, the germs that cause the most familiar diseases were just being identified. And these germs got into the body in fairly obvious ways. Cholera, you swallow it. Tuberculosis or diphtheria is inhaled. But the idea that another way that germs could get into the body was through an insect was not out there.
In August 1881, at an international scientific conference in Havana, Carlos Finley unveiled his mosquito theory, outlining 3 conditions necessary for the transmission of yellow fever.
Number 1, the presence of a person with yellow fever. Number 2, a person apt to contract yellow fever. And number 3, an agent that can transmit yellow fever from a sick person to a healthy person. And he tells them that in light of all this, all the focus on quarantines and all the other measures that they were proposing to take to control yellow fever would be useless, and that what they really needed to focus on was the intermediate agent.
At the end of Finley's presentation, there were no questions, no rebuttals. No one spoke against my theory, Finley later recalled. But I would have preferred it to the silence. That conspiracy of silence. And silence.
Finley is so far out on the edge, so far ahead of his time, there's no way the medical community is going to take him seriously. He becomes the mosquito man, the crazy Cuban doctor, who's got this wild theory about insects carrying disease.
For the next 20 years, Finley worked tirelessly to win scientific acceptance for his theory. Conducting experiments with mosquitoes on 100 volunteers, he focused on transmission while others searched for a cause.
Scientists all over the world are drawing blood from yellow fever patients. They're culturing the blood. They're trying to identify the bacterium that causes yellow fever. Finley wasn't doing that. He was concentrating on mosquitoes.
What Finley needs to do is to show that he can consistently move yellow fever person to person using the mosquito as a vector. That there is no other explanation for that person's case of yellow fever. And in general, he can't do that. He can get a case here and there, sporadic cases, but he still is missing conclusive proof.
Because he's working in Havana, which is an endemic center of yellow fever, people would say, well, maybe your patients caught yellow fever not from the mosquito bite, but from something else in the atmosphere. He could never really adequately answer those objections.
Finley's theory languished. In 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. 40,000 American troops landed on the island of Cuba, a Spanish colony.
Cuba has been suspected for decades as being the source of the yellow fever that comes into the United States. It's an endemic disease in Cuba. It's always there. And that raises all sorts of fears. There's fears about soldiers and becoming infected in Cuba. There's fears about soldiers returning from Cuba and bringing yellow fever with them. It really opens up a whole new pathway for yellow fever to infect the United States.
In only 3 months, the American army defeated Spain and occupied Cuba. Fewer than 400 American soldiers were lost to Spanish bullets, but more than 2,000 came down with Yellow Jack. An African-American regiment, the 24th Infantry, lost 1/3 of its men to the disease. Two years into the occupation, a yellow fever epidemic raged across the island. The lives of 15,000 American troops were at risk.
Because they didn't understand the role of the mosquito, what they would do is someone would catch yellow fever, they'd be put in a hospital next to someone who had malaria, next to someone else who had typhus. Meanwhile, there are mosquitoes buzzing around them, biting one, biting the other, spreading disease back and forth.
We thought that it was transmitted by fomites. Fomite was any inanimate object that could transmit an illness, and so there was felt to be something on the clothes, on the furniture, the sheets that the sick people slept on. There was felt to be something in those materials that could transmit the disease.
In July 1900, an outbreak of yellow fever was reported at a U.S. camp just west of Havana. American troops now faced the same danger as other armies who had ventured into the region.
Yellow fever had been the enemy of colonial powers in the Caribbean for a long time. It had destroyed an army that Napoleon sent to Haiti in 1802, and in the 1890s, it had devastated Spanish armies in Cuba. Americans were well aware of all of this, so they were very fearful that their armies in Cuba not suffer the same way.
The officer in charge of protecting the health of U.S. troops was Surgeon General George Sternberg, a leading bacteriologist. Like many scientists, Sternberg had spent years searching for the yellow fever germ. Now he appointed an ambitious army doctor to lead a commission to Havana to try to find it. Major Walter Reed was the youngest man ever to be granted a medical degree by the University of Virginia. After 2 decades of service in the American West, he was not one to shy away from a challenge.
Reed is a frontier doctor, basically. Most of his career has been spent out on the frontier. Indian country in Arizona, in Kansas, in Nebraska. He takes a class in bacteriology at Johns Hopkins, and it begins to transform him, brings him into contact with the new science of medicine. He moves from this frontier doctor, working with small army posts, and now becomes a scientist.
He was highly motivated. He worked most of his life with the idea that there was going to be an opportunity for him to make a big difference.
Reed chose a trusted friend, James Carroll, as his assistant. To head the laboratory at Havana's Columbia Barracks, he named a young American bacteriologist, Jesse Lazier. The Yellow Fever Board's first task was to disprove an Italian scientist's claim that he had found the elusive yellow fever germ.
There had been a lot of research, a lot of people trumpeting their discovery, and then someone else has to come along and prove that that one's wrong. And this had happened a lot. The problem was that, and they didn't realize it, yellow fever is caused by a virus. It's a particle that cannot be seen through the kinds of microscopes they had in 1900.
Jesse Lazier chafed at what he saw as his colleagues' focus on petty scientific disputes. Reed and Carroll have notions that I don't agree with, he wrote, and are not inclined to do as much as I would like to see done. Left on his own, Lazier believed he could discover the real cause of yellow fever.
I have this picture of Lazier as being a real go-getter. He knows he's smart, he knows he's got the training, he's got the education, and he's got an opportunity now to make a name for himself in the world of medical research.
Lazier had arrived in Cuba with his son, Houston, and his wife, Mabel, who carried their second child. Camera in hand, the young couple enjoyed the historic sights of Havana. A contract surgeon, Dr. Lazier had left behind a position as head of the laboratories at Johns Hopkins University, where he had been working on malaria, only recently proved to be carried by an intermediate host.
Malaria and yellow fever are both diseases that occurred in certain patterns that matched when the mosquito was active. It's worse in more tropical areas, so it made sense that this disease, yellow fever, could be, like malaria, spread by a mosquito.
On May 23rd, Lazier struck out on his own. He went to Quemados, a Havana suburb and the starting point of the 1900 epidemic, and brought back 4 mosquitoes captured in an infected person's room. He dissected the insects and looked in vain for the yellow fever germ. Then, in July, Lazier, Reed, and the rest of the board paid a visit to Old Havana, to the home of Dr. Finley.
In a sense, Finley was the last option. They had tried everything. They had tried sanitation, they had cleaned Havana, they had disproved various candidates for yellow fever, but they hadn't actually found the agent. With so many troops falling sick and yellow fever being a threat to the American occupation, they finally proved willing to listen to Finley.
As he handed his Aedes aegypti eggs to the yellow fever board, Carlos Finley had every reason to be pleased.
Finally, somebody's taking him seriously. Finally, somebody is going to test out his theory, take his mosquitoes, and give it a shot.
On August 2nd, Walter Reed left for Washington. Although deeply skeptical of Finley's theory, Reed had instructed his staff to begin conducting mosquito experiments.
They agreed at that point in time that as they began their mosquito experiments, they would experiment on themselves, that they would be the first guinea pigs to take the mosquito bites to see if they could transmit yellow fever.
Convinced that mosquitoes were harmless, Reed expected little to happen in his absence. He could not have been more mistaken. Jesse Lazier took over Finley's mosquitoes. Meticulously following Finley's techniques, each day, Lazier would take his birds, as he called them, to Los Animas, the U.S. Army Yellow Fever Ward. There, he would have them load, feed on the blood of infected patients. Then he would have the loaded mosquitoes bite healthy volunteers. After 9 inoculations, 2 on himself, Lazier had failed to produce a single case of yellow fever. Discouraged, he was ready to give up. Then, on August 27th, Lazier noted that one of his birds had failed to load. Concerned that the mosquito might die without a blood meal, he asked his colleague James Carroll if he would allow it to feed. 2 days later, Carol fell ill. He appeared jaundiced. His temperature rose to 103 degrees. He was diagnosed with yellow fever.
Lazier takes it upon himself to go find another volunteer. The young soldier named William Dean is bitten by the same mosquito that has made Carol ill. Dean, a few days later, gets sick, and so he progresses to what is an obvious case of yellow fever.
Dear Mabel, Lazier wrote his wife, who had returned to the United States to give birth. I rather think I'm on the track of the real germ, but nothing must be said as yet. I have not mentioned it to a soul.
He's the physician who inoculates Carol, which is the first case that the team probably transmits from the mosquito to a person. He's the person who inoculates William Dean, who is definitely the first case that the Army team transmits yellow fever to with a mosquito. If he can prove that the mosquito transmits yellow fever, the potential for a Nobel Prize may not be out of line.
The morning of September 18th, Jesse Lazier did not report to work. The next day, he was taken by ambulance to the Columbia Barracks Hospital. Lazier explained that he had been bitten by a stray mosquito while loading at Los Animas. But a page from his laboratory book later revealed that he had knowingly subjected himself to the bite of an infected mosquito.
When Lazier exposes himself to yellow fever, he probably doesn't think that his risk of dying is all that great. He's infected two other people, James Carroll and William Dean, and they've become ill, but they're both recovering. Lazier probably believes that he too can produce a case of yellow fever in himself, and that he too can recover and carry on his work.
News of Lazier's illness reached Walter Reed in Pennsylvania. A career military man, Reed now realized that he had left his men in harm's way. I have been so ashamed of myself for being here in a safe country, he wrote, while my associates have been coming down with Yellow Jack. Still, I feel that Lazier will pull through. Lazier progressed to an advanced case of yellow fever. In the delirium of his final hours, a friend reported he was tormented by thoughts of his wife and son, and the daughter he would never meet.
When she got the telegram, Dr. Lazier died this evening, she was in horrible shock because she didn't even know he was sick. Didn't know that he had yellow fever. She just got a telegram that he had died.
He was a splendid, brave fellow, and I lament his loss more than words can tell, wrote a devastated Reed. But his death was not in vain. His name will live in the history of those who have benefited humanity. When he had left for Washington 6 weeks before Lazier's death, Reed had doubted Finley's mosquito theory. Now, as he returned to Cuba on October 4th, he was firmly converted to the belief that the mosquito was indeed the transmitter of yellow fever.
Reed has got to be comfortable before he tells the world that, in fact, he has an indisputable case of experimentally transmitted yellow fever where the mosquito was the agent of the disease.
Known to be cautious and meticulous, Reed now worked furiously. He pored over Lazier's lab books and noted a 12-day interval between the time of loading and the day the mosquito transmitted yellow fever to Carol. 16 days in the case of Dean. This observation fit with a theory developed by a doctor in Mississippi that there was a lapse of 2 weeks between the first appearance of yellow fever and the appearance of a second case.
The light bulb probably just went off and said, hey, this is it. You've got to have this period in the mosquito. Not sure what takes place in the mosquito, but it must take place in the mosquito, and it must take at least 12 days for it to happen. So I think that was kind of an epiphany type thing.
During that 12-day interval, the virus ingested with a blood meal matures in the mosquito's digestive tract, making its way to the salivary glands to be transmitted when the mosquito bites again. This was the missing piece, the one that had eluded Carlos Finley. Less than 3 weeks after returning to Cuba on October 23rd, Reed made his case for the mosquito theory at a gathering of the American Public Health Association.
It basically had 2 cases. It had Carol's case, it had Dean's case. Lazier had died, but they had no evidence that he had experimented upon himself at that point in time. He and Sternberg wanted to get this published as soon as they could because they knew there were other people working in the field and they wanted to get credit for the Army board and for the men involved.
While some observers were impressed, the Washington Post called the mosquito theory silly and nonsensical. Faced with skepticism, Reed realized that he needed incontrovertible proof. He obtained permission to pay $100 in gold to American soldiers and Spanish immigrants to serve as volunteers, $100 more if they became ill. Though all were required to sign consent forms, the human experiments triggered a wave of criticism. The Spanish consul in Cuba issued a formal complaint to the American authorities. Reed was undeterred. On November 20th, 1900, at an isolated spot in Havana, Walter Reed opened a specially designed experimental station. He called it Camp Lazier.
He designs a camp that accounts for just about everything that he can think of that might interfere or put any doubt into his results. It has to be precise, scientific method. There can be no sloppiness at all in what he does.
He placed his volunteers in 2 separate cabins, which he called Building 1 and Building 2.
They put one set of volunteers in a cabin that was screened, and the cabin was loaded up with all sorts of nasty things from yellow fever patients. Blankets they'd vomited on and just all sorts of diarrhea on the things. And they had to sleep in these beds and these pillows that were soaked from yellow fever victims, many of whom had died.
The other building that Reed sets up is Building 2. It's called the Infected Mosquito Building. Same size as the Infected Clothing Building, but it's divided into 2 chambers with a screen between the 2 chambers. In one side of the building is a volunteer. Infected mosquitoes are let loose into the building, and they bite the volunteer.
The people who were exposed to mosquitoes, they caught yellow fever. The people in the fomite cabin, of course, never did catch yellow fever. It was an elegant and clever experiment, and it convinced the scientific world that it wasn't some particle of yellow fever contagion in the blood or in skin tissue or something like that, that it had to be transmitted via mosquitoes. He convinces the scientific world where Finley couldn't.
Reed invited Carlos Finley to Camp Lazeer to witness the success of his experiment. "I suppose old Dr. Finley will be delighted beyond bounds," Reed wrote, "as he will see his theory at last fully vindicated." It had been 20 years since Finley had postulated that getting rid of yellow fever meant controlling the mosquito. Now, Major William Gorgas, Chief Sanitary Officer, ordered U.S. Army troops onto every street and into every home in Cuba's capital, putting Finley's theory to the test.
As soon as he heard about a case of yellow fever, the patient was put in a screened room so that the mosquitoes couldn't get in or out. And they did things to eradicate any mosquitoes that were in that room.
Teams move out across the city, fumigating homes and buildings, tracking down places where mosquitoes breed, eliminating standing water.
The campaign was a resounding success. In 1900, there had been 300 yellow fever deaths in Havana. The next year, following the mosquito eradication campaign, there was only one.
Despite what had happened in Cuba, despite the fact that yellow fever had gone away from Havana effectively, within months, not years, but months, people still didn't accept the theory that insects could carry disease.
Back in Washington, Walter Reed spent much of his time trying to convince health officials that controlling mosquitoes was the key to controlling yellow fever.
Reed was particularly frustrated with some of the leaders of Southern Public Health and the State Board of Health of Louisiana. He wrote a letter to one of his friends and said, maybe we should arrange for a few of them to be bitten by some loaded stegomyia, the name they had for the Aedes aegypti mosquito, to get them out of the way.
But Reed's influence in the yellow fever debate would come to an unexpected end. In 1902, Walter Reed died from complications of appendicitis. The nation's champion of the mosquito theory was gone. New Orleans, 1905. The city, once known as the necropolis of the South, had been relatively free of yellow fever for more than 2 decades. Proud officials attributed the success to a wall of quarantine stations, specially designed to keep the disease at bay.
When a ship came in, they would make sure that no one aboard the ship had yellow fever. Then they would go aboard the ship, they would fumigate it, they would wash it, they would use everything from vinegar to smoke to try to cleanse the ship, to sanitize it.
They filled the holds of ships with sulfurous acid gas. They took all the bedding and clothing and hung it up in sort of giant autoclaves. I mean, they were these giant ovens, and toasted the clothing up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a very impressive-looking apparatus and a very active service. The whole system had seemed to work for 20 years, so now they're supposed to just shut these things down. It did not seem prudent.
The head of the New Orleans Health Board, Dr. Whitman Conkey, disagreed. A firm believer in the mosquito theory, he urged his colleagues to put in place a program of mosquito control.
Conkey said, this is what we need to be doing. We need laws about screening cisterns and all the rest of it. He didn't get very far, and people somewhat laughed at him. They drew cartoons of this guy. St. George and the Dragon fighting off a huge mosquito.
In the spring of 1905, a smuggler's ship with a cargo of bananas bridged New Orleans' quarantine wall and quietly made its way through the backwaters of the Mississippi. On June 12th, 2 suspicious deaths were reported near the waterfront. Yellow fever once again threatened New Orleans, and once again, the city was unprepared. Without effective mosquito controls in place, millions of Aedes aegypti bred undisturbed, most dangerously in the 70,000 backyard cisterns where families stored their water. On June 22nd, New Orleans authorities declared an emergency. By then, 100 people had come down with the disease. 20 had died. Conkey decided there was no more time to waste. Even if you are not positive that the mosquito is the only source of the transmission of yellow fever, he told New Orleans physicians, give your city the benefit of the doubt in this important and vital matter. Under Conkey's direction, New Orleans organized as if for war. Science has discovered the cause and has learned to exterminate it, heralded the New Orleans Picayune. The mosquito control techniques that the U.S. Army had used so effectively in Havana were now applied to the Crescent City. House by house, block by block, workmen screened cisterns to prevent mosquitoes from laying eggs. To suffocate the larvae, all standing water was treated with kerosene. Saturdays and Sundays were declared fumigation days. On a single day, residents burned an estimated 300 tons of sulfur, giving the mosquito, as the Picayune put it, a dose of real brimstone. Citizens were urged to sleep under nets and help with the oiling and screening of cisterns. Fines of up to $25 or 30 days in prison were issued to those who failed to comply. It was a race against the mosquito. But years of inaction had given the Aedes aegypti a head start. Barely a month after the beginning of the epidemic, 600 yellow fever cases were reported.
The epidemic is spreading, and the city doesn't have enough money to fight the epidemic. So what they do is call in the federal government. There's a lot of resentment to federal power, but also recognition that that's the only way we're going to get this disease under control.
We regard this as the first crucial test in America of the mosquito theory, proclaimed federal authorities. And it must be perfect to be efficient.
They have a mission: destroy the mosquito. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. If you don't cooperate, they'll do it for you.
Whenever a new case of fever was reported, a squad went immediately to screen the patient's room and fumigate the house. They were instructed to behave unemotionally and get their work done. It was like watching a huge machine, well-oiled and efficacious, one reporter wrote. Still, the epidemic seemed to be getting out of control. On August 12th, 100 people became ill. Years before, the numbers of sick would have risen exponentially. Thousands would have died by the first frost. But this time, The mosquito control measures that so many had doubted made all the difference. In September, the number of victims began to decline. A month later, the epidemic was all but over. The final tally for the city of New Orleans was 452 deaths, a fraction of the toll exacted by epidemics in the past.
It really was a triumph for science in an era when the expert is increasingly being called upon to guide government action.
It would go down in history as America's most successful public health campaign, and the last ever waged against yellow fever in the United States. The brilliance of Carlos Finley, the dedication of Walter Reed, and the sacrifice of Jesse Lazier spared the United States the suffering and fear that once made Yellow Jack the nation's most dreaded epidemic. Though a cure for yellow fever has not been found, nor the virus eradicated, in the United States, there has not been a yellow fever epidemic for more than 100 years.
There's more at American Experience Online. Visit companion websites for each American Experience episode with interactive features, additional interviews, plus rare videos and photos. All this and more at pbs.org. Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.